Brothers and sisters, that's right. It's time once again for the In My Grow Show, the podcast dedicated to taking the mystery out of cannabis. Once again, I'm Alex. So as always, I want to start the show by thanking all the musicians that let me use their music to put the show together. I also want to give a special thank you to all of you for taking the time to listen. I really do appreciate it. Later on, I'm going to play a conversation that I recorded with Dr. David Bierman about the endocannabinoid system. So the show is going to run a little longer than usual. And let me know what you think about the longer show, if you like it, if you'd rather have it shorter. But first, I want to talk about biological predators. I'm going to turn down the music a little bit. So last time I was talking about how I've been having problems with spider mites this year. It's not bad, but it seems like I've been having to pay a little more attention to it than last season. So a friend of mine turned me on to a company called Rincon Vitova. And they're an insectary that specializes in biological predators. For example, things like ladybugs, lacewings, praying mantises, nematodes. So I went over and looked them up, got on their website. And that is rinconvitrova.com, rinconvitova.com. And it's a pretty cool little website. But the thing I really liked about it was in the resource part. They had a couple of things that I found really interesting. One was an index by predator, which, if you know the Latin name for the predator that you want for whatever pest you need to get rid of, you can find it there. Me, I don't know my bugs that well, so the other index they have is an index by pest. So you go over there. So I go over there and look up whatever pest I'm having a problem with. Looked up spider mite, and they give the predator that's good for it, which for spider mites is the Amblysius thalassus. I don't know if I got that one right. Another really awesome thing is that they're local here in California, and even more local than that, they're pretty close to where I live. I mean, I can drive there. It's like maybe 30 minutes away. So after I looked around the website, I reached out to them and I spoke to Kira and Ron over there. They were nice enough to take a few minutes to talk to me on the phone. And we set it up so they would come on the show and help give us some basic information about biological predators. Which ones are good for spider mites, root aphids, caterpillars, and also the different things, the different considerations that we have to have if you're running an indoor grow, a greenhouse grow, or you're growing outdoors and sun grown. So I'm going to have them on hopefully the next show. That's what I'm shooting for. Go over to the website and check it out. They do have a lot of good information. And if you do wind up talking to them or emailing them, let them know you heard about them from the In My Grow Show. And just to be clear, full disclosure, no, they don't pay me for this. Like I said, this is something a friend of mine told me about. I'm just trying to pass along the information. Alright, next, let's do the strain of the week. Now I'm going to give it up to Sour Diesel. Sour Diesel is a sativa dominant hybrid. They say it comes from a cross of the Chemdog 91 and the Super Skunk. Now she has a very fuely, very gassy smell to her. Also smells like wet dirt. I first had Sour Diesel back in the mid-90s when I was still living in Texas. I remember she gave me the feeling of both relaxation and focus to get stuff done. And she's a great strain too. I love coming back to her every now and then, man. Well, brothers and sisters, as promised, next up, I've got that conversation with Dr. David Bierman. And Dr. Bierman has almost 40 years of experience in the drug abuse treatment and prevention field. He was a co-director of the Haight-Ashbury Drug Treatment Program. and is currently a member of both the Santa Barbara and the San Diego County Drug Abuse Technical Advisory Committee. And he was nice enough to give me about an hour of his time to talk about the endocannabinoid system, which I was really grateful for because Dr. Bierman's a really busy guy. So I'm going to take a short break, and when I come back, I'm going to have that conversation about the endocannabinoid system with Dr. Bierman. Folks, today I've got Dr. David Bierman with me, one of the most knowledgeable doctors in America in the field of medical cannabis. I was lucky enough to see Dr. Bierman speak in July at a small cannabis conference here in Santa Barbara. Dr. Bierman, welcome to the show and thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I think what you're doing is really important because people need to know how to grow their own medicine and be self-reliant and have personal responsibility for their health. So I think what you're doing is terrific.
Well, thank you, Doc. I appreciate that. I've got a lot of questions, not a lot, I've got quite a few questions about the endocannabinoid system.
That's great. This is a good time to talk about it. People are becoming more and more interested, not only in the endocannabinoid system, but in some of the many of the 113 cannabinoids that are in the cannabis plant, as well as the medical value of the terpenes, the things that give cannabis its odor. And you really need to understand the endocannabinoid system to appreciate the incredible breadth of applications that cannabis has for medical conditions to help them respond to the symptoms that people have, make the symptoms easier to deal with, and in some cases even cure the condition that the person has.
So I'm going to tell you what the limited stuff that I know about the endocannabinoid system, and then we'll go from there. So the endocannabinoid system, endo stands for endogenous, meaning that those are the cannabinoids that the body makes themselves.
Correct.
Okay, and the two cannabinoids that the body makes is anandamide and 2-AG.
Correct.
And the receptors that we've identified, and I say we as the human race,
right,
is CB1 and CB2 receptors.
Right, but there are also some other minor receptors as well. There's something I think called the GP50 for GB55. I was talking to Jake Felice, who is a naturopath. He sometimes sees patients in an office here in my office complex. And he's somebody that you may want to talk to as well, because the naturopaths get trained in plant-based medicine, and the allopaths, which is what I am, an MD, is we don't get any training in that. And so it's important to understand plants and how they work as medicine. And the fact of the matter is that at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, all of our medicine was plant-based. And my father was a pharmacist, and in the 1920s, when he started practicing pharmacy, he said that the pharmacists compounded 95% of the prescriptions and only 5% were manufactured. And by the time he retired in the 1970s, those figures were reversed. And we need to learn more about the value of plant-based medicine. After all, they've served humankind for thousands and thousands of years, and they usually have far less side effects than synthetic pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, it's a weird cultural thing that we, as in a Western culture, we've gotten used to taking our medicine in a pill form.
Right. And what Jake talked about was the various receptors, not only CB1 and CB2, but I think the GB50, and then there's something called the vanilloid receptors. So the endocannabinoid system, I think the problem with it in terms of your audience is it's a little bit complicated, and we're better off just talking about the CB1 and CB2 receptors. The CB1 receptors are largely in the brain, but they are throughout the body. One of the good things about the CB1 receptors is there are few or none in the brainstem, which is why nobody has ever died from an overdose of cannabis. The brainstem controls respiration, and when people die from an overdose of drugs, it's because of suppression of respiration.
So then when some people let's say, smoke too much pot and they start, starts affecting their breathing, that's mostly anxiety then. It's got nothing to do with the drug itself, with cannabis.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
As a matter of fact, in terms of the effect on the respiratory system, in the 1920s there were at least 3 different cigarettes, Canadana, Cigars de Joy, and Grimaldi, that were marketed for treatment of asthma because, like today's pharmaceutical asthma preparations, cannabis is both an anti-inflammatory and a bronchodilator. So it's kind of counterintuitive because you do have irritation of the bronchial tree as a result of the smoke, but if you're using cannabis in a tincture form, then you get the benefit of the anti-inflammatory and bronchodilatory effect without the irritation of the bronchial tree.
So that smoking cannabis doesn't affect the lungs the way like cigarette smoke would.
No, let me go into that in a little bit more detail. There's a wonderful researcher at UCLA named Donald Tashkin. He's an emeritus professor of pulmonology. He started doing research on cannabis in the 1970s and had received a number of grants from NIDA. That is until he proved that cannabis not only does not cause lung cancer, but actually probably prevents lung cancer, and that's smoking it. Now, what he did find is that if you smoke cannabis, you're going to have increased cough, increased sputum production, and increased bronchial irritation. And so he did this study in the early part of this century, around 2000, where he looked at 1,100 people in the Los Angeles Cannabis Cancer Directory who had cancer of the head and neck. And he, as a control group, he took people of similar age, sex, and geographic neighborhood and took a look at their tobacco smoking and marijuana smoking habits. And basically what he found is that if you smoke cannabis, your chances of getting lung cancer were less than if you smoke nothing at all. And that's reasonable because we know that there is plenty of evidence demonstrating that cannabis kills cancer cells. In fact, Dr. Donald Abrams, who's an oncologist and a professor at UC San Francisco Medical School, said there's more than enough basic science research and anecdotal reports to justify doing double-blind studies to see whether or not cannabis kills cancer cells and in humans. Because I can say cannabis will cure cancer in your mouse because we've done those double-blind studies. There's only been one double-blind study that's been done on humans. That was done on glioblastoma in the United Kingdom, and it showed a 40% increase in lifespan of those treated with conventional treatment plus cannabis with conventional treatment alone. Now, there were some problems with that study as far as I'm concerned. Basically, they didn't use a high enough dose of THC and CBD. They only used 75 milligrams of each, whereas mostly healers use 3 to 6 times that amount. So I'm waiting to see what additional studies have to say. And I'm very disturbed with the federal government not jumping on cannabis for its effect at being able to cure cancer in your mouse. I mean, we've known since 1974 that cannabis kills cancer cells, and there have been an enormous number of studies that demonstrate that in cell cultures and in small animals, and only one study that I'm aware of in humans. It's been a double-blind study. There was a safety study that was done in Madrid many years ago, in which they injected, I think it was just THC, directly into glioblastoma in 9 patients, and in 2 of the 9 the cancer got smaller, and yes, it was safe. But we need to look at that more aggressively. And I mean, there's plenty of evidence. I mean, it doesn't work by magic. Just because it was illegal doesn't mean it does everything for every condition. But it actually inhibits the formation of new blood vessels, and cancer tissue, like normal tissue, needs to be nourished and needs to have blood vessels. It also inhibits something called the ID1 gene, which promotes metastasis, which is not a good thing, cancer cells going throughout your body. But more importantly, cannabis encourages apoptosis, which is programmed death of old or abnormal cells. Now, there was a cancer patient who was a biochemist named Dennis Hill, and his theory was that there is a particular lipid that's in all cells called ceramide, Ceramide, and it's in higher concentration in cancer cells. And that what cannabis does is increases the amount of ceramide until it kills the cell. So that cannabis, unlike conventional chemotherapy, targets only the abnormal cells and doesn't kill the normal cells. So, I mean, the problem with the anecdotal reports, and there are people who said, boy, I had cancer and it went away because of cannabis, is we don't know whether or not that represents 1 out of 1,000 people that tried it or 1,000 out of 1,000 people that tried it, and that's why we need to do double-blind studies.
Yeah, there is a lot of animal research out there about cannabis, but there's very little as far as on the National Institute of Health's website about actual human studies on cannabis that really should be done.
Right, and even the human studies that have been done, most of them have been done with synthetic THC. Few have been done based on the entourage effect, which is a concept that was developed by Dr. Meshulam, who characterized the structure of THC and isolated it in 1964. In 1999, he said the entourage effect is the combined therapeutic effects of all of the therapeutic constituents of the plant. And plants are complicated. Coffee has 880 molecules in it. Tomato has 380. Cannabis has 512. 113 of those molecules are cannabinoids, which is a 21 carbon molecule that either blocks or stimulates the body's CB1 or CB2 receptors, and it has more than 200 terpenes. Terpenes are what give the plant its unique odor, and it's the most common molecule in nature. There are about 20,000 terpenes in nature, and many of the terpenes have therapeutic value. Limonene, for instance, and linalool are both anti-anxiety drugs. Limonene, as its name might suggest, is found in citrus fruit. Linalool is found in lavender. And the aromatherapists have kind of figured out, the thing about terpenes and how the aromas may be helpful for people.
I want to ask you about the CB2 receptors.
Okay.
Where are they mostly found? You said the CB1s are mostly found in the nervous system?
Correct.
And the CB2 receptors?
CB2 receptors are mainly in the immune system. And we know that cannabis is useful in treating autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, scleroderma, lupus erythematosus. It's also useful in treating ulcerative colitis, which is very important. Ulcerative colitis is inflammation of the bowel. It also causes sort of rapid peristalsis, and so people with ulcerative colitis often have diarrhea. And what cannabis does is two things. One is it's an anti-inflammatory, so you have less inflammation. But number two, the endocannabinoid system is important in terms of modulating the speed of neurotransmission. And what happens is if you increase the amount of cannabinoids, you'll also increase the amount of another neurotransmitter called dopamine. And dopamine is responsible for depolarizing neurons. By depolarizing the neuron, it slows down the speed of neural stimulation. So if you have ulcerative colitis, for instance, and your waste products are going through your GI tract at warp speed, there's not enough time for them to sit in your large bowel and be dewatered, so you have diarrhea. On the other hand, with cannabis, it can slow down the speed of neurotransmission and slow down the peristalsis so that the waste products sit around for a more normal time in the large bowel and can be dewatered. And so they may not have normal stools, but they tend to be better formed. And there was actually a study that I participated in with Dr. Jeff Hergenrather and the late Dr. Todd Mikaria, where we sent out a questionnaire to about 15 of our patients, or 15 of our patients responded who had ulcerative colitis, and they said they had less abdominal pain, fewer bowel movements, better form bowel movements, and many of them were able to decrease the amount of medication they were taking, and some people could stop taking the medication entirely. And one of the medications that's commonly used for ulcerative colitis are steroids, and steroids can have a long-term negative effect on people. So if you can decrease the dose of them or stop using them, you're better off.
The endocannabinoids that the body makes, anandamide and 2-AG, do they affect both the CB1 and the CB2 receptors?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know exactly the answer to that. I know that anandamide largely affects the CB1 receptors, but I don't really know whether it affects the CB2 receptors. You know, if your audience is interested in this, there is an organization called the International Cannabinoid Research Society, and they've been in existence since sometime in the 1990s. Every other year they're in North America. Next year's they're going to be in North America, and I don't know where they're going to be. I mean, the last time they were in North America, they were in Montreal. This last year they were in the Netherlands, and they meet at the end of June and the beginning of July. They usually have about 200 or 300 poster presentations, and you can walk around and actually talk to the researcher that did the research, and then they have about another 200 verbal presentations that are usually about 15 minutes in length, and they go into a lot of this information. And these people know a lot more about the endocannabinoid system than I do, because as a physician, I try to apply the practical application of what the basic science researchers are discovering. So certainly the CBD, because it's an anti-inflammatory, is going to affect the immune system. It's going to affect the immune system. And so the CBD is going to affect the CB2 receptors. Now, the CBD also affects the CB1 receptors. It partially fits into the CB1 receptor, and that has a fancy name called allosteric binding. The way I explain it to my patients is that it partially fits into the receptor, kind of like O.J.'s fingers fit into the glove at trial, whereas the THC fits into the receptor the way O.J.'s fingers fit into the gloves when he bought them.
That's a really good analogy. I like that.
Thank you.
Now let's talk about...
Oh, let me finish up on the CBD.
Sure.
So the CBD tends to partially block the euphoria caused by the THC, and that's because by fitting in there partially, it changes the way that the THC fits into the CB1 receptor.
So if you have a little bit of CBD with your THC or vice versa, it's going to act to lessen the effects of that THC. It's going to be less intoxicated.
Right. And what I found is that it probably decreases the euphoria by about a third. And most of the time, for many conditions, you don't need as high a dose of THC as might cause euphoria. Say for anxiety or attention deficit disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. 2.5 to 5 milligrams of THC, and if you want to add the same amount or double the amount of CBD, that's fine. But if you have pain, what I found is you need to have about 15 milligrams of THC in order to effectively treat pain. And about 15-20% of people are kind of uncomfortable at 15 milligrams. So if you add in 15 milligrams of CBD, you not only get the benefit of the anti-inflammatory effect of the CBD, but you get the effect of it partially blocking the euphoria. And so it probably brings it down to like taking 10 milligrams of THC. Now, I came to this conclusion by getting a phone call from the wife of the elderly patient of mine who had severe arthritis and pain from that. And I told him, I said, you want a 1-to-1 ratio, and I thought I suggested that you start, low and go slow, but didn't follow that. And the wife calls me up the next day and says, my husband is hallucinating. I said, really? I said, what's he taking? 1-to-1. I said, really? How much THC and CBD is in there? 30 milligrams. So I figured, look, if it only reduces it by 30% or half, it's like taking 20 milligrams of THC, and that's enough to get many people much higher than they'd like to be.
Yeah, especially if you're new to it too.
Exactly. So I don't know whether he continued to use the cannabis or not. I told him to, that's what was going on there.
Yeah.
But it was something that originally I was a little bit, flummoxed with that. Why is he getting high? This is supposed to block the euphoria. It doesn't totally block the euphoria. It only partially blocks the euphoria.
On that same line, then, let's talk about the differences between delta-9 THC and 11-hydroxate, isn't that what THC turns into after it's been metabolized?
Exactly. There are a couple of metabolites of THC. The first one is 11-hydroxy THC, and that is actually more euphorogenic. It causes more euphoria than THC. An example of why you need to start low and go slow comes from Maureen Dowd, who was a columnist for the New York Times. And in 2014, shortly after they legalized the recreational or adult use of cannabis in Colorado, she was sent out there to see what was going on. And so she went into a dispensary, she got a candy bar, and the candy bar had 100 milligrams of THC and 1 milligram of CBD. And it was scored into, appropriate dosages. So she broke off a piece, probably 10 milligrams, and waited 15 minutes and nothing happened. Because when you take a medication orally, it takes about 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes for it to get high enough concentration in your blood to have therapeutic value. So she took another piece, 10 milligrams, waited another 15 minutes. Well, no, that's 30 minutes altogether, right? Nothing happened. So she ate the whole thing. So now she's got 100 milligrams. She was in a fetal position for 6 hours. My advice to your audience is don't do that. Know what you're doing. Know what you're taking. Now, sometimes people are foolish. I mean, they don't listen to their doctors, but they may listen to their friends. So, I mean, I recommend to people that, if they go into a dispensary, read the label. And read the label for how much THC it has and how much CBD it has, because the names are meaningless. And Jeff Raber gave a presentation a couple of years ago and said, yeah, there's no relationship between the content of these strains. There's no consistency. They're all over the map. And I think there were only 2 strains that he found had some consistency. I think Harlequin and Jack Hare, and everything else was just a big mishmash. So you really need to go by what the label says is
in the percentage-wise.
Percentage-wise or milligram-wise.
Oh, yeah, correct.
Right. I mean, because with percentage-wise, you need to do the math.
Well, that's true. So do you know what the difference is as far as potency between regular delta-9 THC and the 11-hydroxate?
No, I don't. That's a good question. But the thing with the oral is that there's going to be a 45-minute to hour and 15-minute lag.
And that's because people's metabolism is different?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We're all different. We have different amounts of the endocannabinoid enzymes. We haven't talked about that. But there are 2 enzymes. One's called fatty acid anhydrase is what that stands for. And the other one is called Mygl, and I forget what that stands for. Okay. I think it's MYGL. Anyway, they metabolize the anandamide and the 2-AG, and they also metabolize the phytocannabinoids, the cannabinoids that are found in cannabis. So we have different amounts of those. We have different amounts of the CB1 and CB2 receptors. We have different amounts of dopamine, different amounts of dopamine transporter. I mean, there's an enormous amount of variability in humans. We get it when we take a look at, height and weight. That's distributed on a bell-shaped curve. So is everything inside distributed on a bell-shaped curve. So some of us are going to have what Dr. Daniel Piamelli at UC Irvine and Dr. Ethan Russo, who probably knows more about cannabis than anybody else in the United States, have termed an endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. And these people tend to have attention deficit disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, may occur in people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a whole constellation of comorbid conditions that can occur in people who have what these guys have deemed an endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome.
So now, on that topic of the deficiency, if your body's not making enough of it, is cannabis the only way to replace those cannabinoids, or are there other plants that may have the similar cannabinoids? I'm just wondering how people who aren't familiar with cannabis, how they wind up replenishing the endocannabinoid system. If there's a different way, or do you
That's
know?
a good question, and that's a question I'd ask a naturopath or a nutritionist.
All right, let's start that list.
You can use a synthetic cannabinoid, except the synthetic cannabinoids don't work as well as cannabis, are more expensive, and have more side effects. But they do work. I mean, I write for synthetic THC often for a number of reasons. One is that sometimes people's insurance will cover it. Another reason is sometimes people feel more comfortable going into an actual drugstore rather than going into a dispensary. And the other reason is, which is less necessary now, is you know exactly what you're getting. I mean, because we've legalized cannabis in California and the regulations require that it be tested, you can be pretty sure that you know what you're getting, as long as the package is appropriately labeled, and it's supposed to be appropriately labeled, but people are still learning. I mean, the labeling regulations just went into effect July 1st, so some of the stuff may not be appropriately labeled. However, the dispensaries are well aware of this, and there was a big fire sale in June.
There was,
yeah.
There were quite a lot of deals everybody had.
Right, and that was the reason why. So in terms of the 11-hydroxy THC, that is going to kick in about an hour, or it's going to last for about 6 hours, and you're going to be uncomfortably high.
And there's no off switch, as far as we know.
Well, there is. There's a number of off switches.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. There's an article that I wrote recently, which is going to appear, on some CBD website, and I'm speaking at their CBD Expo in Anaheim. At any rate, there are a number of different things that you can do in terms of decreasing the high. Now, one of the common things that's done more with smoking, because you're getting a lower dose, is to bite down on a peppercorn. Because pepper has a terpene called caryophyllene, although some people think it's a cannabinoid, and it also partially fills the CB1 receptor.
Now, is that the beta caryophyllene, or either one, the alpha or the beta caryophyllene?
I think it's beta caryophyllene,
Okay.
but again, that's not something that I am that well versed on. Obviously, another thing that you can do is to take CBD. Another thing that you can do is to hydrate. Another thing that you can do is to take a shower. Unfortunately, I think that what you have to do is just wait.
Ride it out, huh?
Yeah.
I want to talk about also how cannabis is a neuroprotectant.
Yes. So, I'm not really sure of the mechanism of action of how it's a neuroprotectant, but it is. I mean, because there have been a lot of studies done with mice where they will, give the mouse cannabis or cannabinoids, and then they will sever their carotid artery, and then they'll sacrifice the mouse. I mean, this is not a good time to be a mouse.
Wow.
What they found is that those mice that were pre-treated with cannabis had less loss of neurons than those that were not treated with that. In fact, Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, who is the Israeli scientist who isolated and characterized the chemical structure of THC in 1964, developed a semi-synthetic cannabinoid called nexabanol, which he had hoped would be used for people that had strokes or people who had traumatic brain injury. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence to demonstrate that. It's really hard to do research. You can't get people to have strokes on demand, or you don't want to introduce traumatic brain injury. But I think it's important for people to know out there, and actually, if you consume the cannabinoids even after you have a stroke or traumatic brain injury, within a short enough period of time, it will preserve some of the brain tissue that otherwise would die as a result of the loss of the blood supply to that area. I think that it has something to do with cleaning up some of the enzymes and some of the neurotransmitters that are formed after there is injury to brain tissue, and those things cause even more injury than the original insult to the brain. But it is definitely neuroprotective. And I would like to say that almost every negative side effect that you have heard discussed about cannabis, the opposite is true. And you do have some people who say that cannabis is destructive to brain tissue, and that is not true. It's based on junk science, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse has funded an enormous amount of junk science. This particular piece of junk science was done in the 1970s by a scientist who was a rabid anti-drug person, and he exposed monkeys to marijuana smoke. And he sacrificed the monkeys and found there was no brain damage. Well, that wouldn't do. So he put gas masks on the monkeys and then introduced marijuana smoke into the gas mask. And of course, this dramatically decreased the amount of oxygen that the brain tissue was getting. And we know that lack of oxygen causes brain damage. So when he sacrificed these monkeys who had been gassed with marijuana, hey, lo and behold, they had brain damage. And it was from lack of oxygen, not from marijuana.
It had nothing to do with the marijuana ingestion. It's just everything was suffocating, basically.
Exactly. You know, so, I mean, the message is breathe oxygen.
It's good for you.
Yeah.
You'll last longer.
That's right.
Doc, can you now? I've read in certain papers about the connection between coupling your opioid use for pain management with cannabis.
Correct.
Because it helps people get to that effective pain relief level with their opioids when they do that with less amount of opioids.
Right.
So,
what the cannabinoid medicine specialists have discovered is that for people who are using cannabis for analgesia, that they can decrease their reliance on opiates by about 30 to 50% of the dose. And for some people, they're able to stop using cannabis altogether. Now, what's really amazing is, I think I mentioned that the International Cannabinoid Research Society met in Montreal last year, and Mark Ware, who is a doctor and a professor at McGill University, came up to me and said, "You'll never guess what your old friend Nora Valkov said." Well, Nora Valkov is not an old friend of mine. She is the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Do you want to turn this off while somebody's pounding away here, or keep talking? Okay, so anyway,
let's keep going. We'll see if it clears up.
She was the keynote speaker at the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and her topic was the opiate epidemic. And he said her first bullet point was to advise these doctors that if they were treating pain, the first thing that they should do was recommend cannabis before they wrote a prescription for opiates. So if the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse says this, it carries a lot of weight, particularly since she has, prior to this, been disparaging the medical effects of cannabis. Now, there are 3 medical schools in California that have institutes that are specifically set up to study cannabis. One of those is at UCLA, and the first study that they're going to do is to take a look at the use of cannabis for replacing opiates for treating pain. Now, the way that cannabis probably works in terms of treating pain, one is that because it slows down the speed of neurotransmission, you're going to have fewer slower moving pain impulses reaching the brain. The other thing is that we have 2 centers of the brain that mediate our interpretation of pain. One of those is mediated by the endocannabinoid system. We're kind of familiar with that. But the other one is mediated by the endocannabinoids. And there have been studies that have shown, I think the study was done with people who had a tooth pulled, that their level of endocannabinoids go up with increased pain. And so it affects the speed of neurotransmission, it affects the interpretation of pain. What my patients with pain have told me is 3 things. One is, I have less pain. The other is, no, I have the same amount of pain, but I don't focus on it as much. I'm able to focus on other things. And then the third group, it's kind of a combination of those 2 things. But there's no question that for most people, cannabis is very helpful as an analgesic. In fact, I mentioned my father's 1927 Remington textbook of pharmacy, which on page 999 and 1000 tells you how to make tincture of cannabis. My dad was really the first person who suggested, even tangentially, that cannabis had therapeutic value. And he was talking about alcohol prohibition, and he said when he was a freshman at the University of Minnesota School of Pharmacy that one of his assignments was to make tincture of cannabis, and he said they had to be very careful because the alcohol was illegal. Recognize that in the 1920s, American physicians wrote 3 million prescriptions a year that contained cannabis. That's 3 million prescriptions a year that contained cannabis. So I looked up cannabis in the textbook that I just mentioned, and it said that it was useful in treating pain, and it was useful in treating anxiety.
Wow. Wow, way back then, how they even knew about it.
Yeah, well, cannabis has been in every major materia medica ever printed, including the first one, which by Chinese oral tradition was in 2637 BC, the Ping Chao Ting, and all of those talk about the use of cannabis for analgesia and pretty much included many of the other conditions that we're aware of today. And in fact, in 1937, the American Medical Association testified against the Marijuana Tax Act, saying that the AMA knew of no dangers from the medical use of cannabis.
That's amazing. So, and I want to go back to something you had mentioned earlier about the phytocannabinoids.
Yes.
Phytocannabinoids, are they the cannabinoids that we get externally?
Yes, the phytocannabinoids, phyto means plant, so they're the plant-based cannabinoids, and they're the ones that are in cannabis. And, it was a good question that you asked about whether there's any other source of cannabinoids, and I'm not aware that there is. I'll tell you, a wonderful book that talks about not only cannabis, but potatoes, apples, and tulips is Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire, and it talks about the development of hemp. Hemp did not develop cannabinoids and terpenes for us to get high or for us to treat our diseases. It did to propagate the plant, to keep pests away from it, and maybe to have its seeds distributed possibly by human beings.
Now, getting back to the entourage effect, I hear a lot of these discussions about CBD, especially commercial CBD that you find in Rite Aid, having 0.3% of THC. Do we know how much THC we need coupled with our CBD to get that entourage effect?
No, we don't. But just going for CBD alone is not a good idea. And one of the things about THC is that you need it for a lot of the therapeutic effects. For instance, Epidiolex, which is a high CBD product produced by JW Pharmaceuticals, has about a 10 to 1 or 12 to 1 CBD to THC ratio. And it decreased the frequency of seizures in children with Dravet syndrome, in which this is basically uncontrolled seizures. They can have hundreds of seizures a day. It decreased it by 39%. Now, in 1947, there was a study done by Ramsey and Clark using synthetic THC, in which they studied 7 children with cerebral palsy who were institutionalized who had intractable seizures. Of the 7, 5 ended up having no or almost no seizures. So that's 71% of the kids had a 100% decrease, or maybe 95% decrease in the frequency of seizures. So these parents who are running out and giving their kids only CBD or high CBD are missing the boat. And you don't need a whole heck of a lot of THC to help decrease the frequency of seizures, and your kid won't get high from that, or maybe get a little high. Matter of fact, I remember a patient that I saw about maybe more than a dozen years ago now. She was a woman in her late 20s who had had 2 intracranial bleeds and had 2 neurosurgery procedures to save her life. She was hemiparetic as a result of the bleeds or the seizure or the surgery. And that means she was partially paralyzed on one side. And she told me, she said, I have seizures all day long, unless I say just a little bit high, and then I never have a seizure. telling me that it was the THC that was important because CBD doesn't get you high. Now, one of the things I want to correct people on in terms of CBD is some people say that it is not a psychotropic, but it is. It's just not. It doesn't cause euphoria. It's an anti-anxiety and antidepressant, so it does have psychoactive effects.
Yeah, I describe it as it's not intoxicating. It gives a, for me, it affects my mental well-being, but it's not an intoxicating kind of feeling that it gives me.
Right, but what a lot of people go along with the Seinfeld, but there's nothing wrong with that.
Sure, there's nothing wrong with that.
What there is something wrong with is dysphoria, which is so much euphoria that you feel uncomfortable and out of touch with reality. And, that's to be avoided unless you're taking cannabis to try to treat your cancer, in which case you can minimize it, but you probably can't avoid it, although you may develop tolerance after, say, 10 to 14 days to the euphoric effect of the very high doses of THC that you need to take in order to kill cancer cells.
Wow. So, Doc, I want to change speeds real quick and talk about your book that's coming out.
Wonderful. So in 2 weeks, I'll be coming out with a new book called Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to the Practice of Cannabinoid Medicine. It's designed for the thinking patient as well as for physicians and nurses who are interested in practicing cannabinoid medicine and want to have a foundation for beginning to discuss cannabis as a medicine with their patient. And I would encourage people to go out and get that. Now, this is kind of a follow-up to a much larger book entitled Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools, Greed, Discrimination, and the War on Drugs, How Medical Marijuana is Changing the Paradigm. But the title is, Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools. And it's about 500 pages long. If you're really a glutton for punishment, you can get it in 2 volumes. That's 550 pages long. It's got lots of nice pictures in it, and you can just read the captions under the pictures and the subject headings, and you will get a lot of information about why we have the crazy drug laws that we have today. And my contention is that drug laws have been used since at least Pope Innocent XVI in the 15th century to marginalize, discriminated against groups, whether or not they're witches, whether or not they're the Irish or the Chinese or the Germans, the Italians. We have used our drug laws throughout the ages, not just in this country, but throughout the world, to marginalize, discriminated against people. And we've used them as kind of the boogeyman. Now, the latest book, Cannabis Medicine, helps even further to demythologize cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. And I think that those people in your audience who are really interested in learning more about this should pick up Cannabis Medicine, and if they find that that's intriguing, then I would encourage them to pick up Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools.
Yeah, I encourage you guys to pick up this book also, Cannabis Medicine. It looks really great. Doctor, can you let everybody know how they can find you, or other doctors how they can find you? Because I've run into a lot of patients who tell me their doctors know very little about cannabis, right, the endocannabinoid system, and how that can help their particular issue.
Well, here in Santa Barbara, I've been here for most of the last 48 years. I started the Isla Vista Medical Clinic in 1970. I've got a meeting tomorrow with Jonathan Abood, who is running, by the way, for the board of the City College. He's on it now, to talk to him about having a 50th anniversary of not only the clinic, but the Isla Vista Community Service Center. And so many doctors in town are aware of my knowledge about this. And I'd say that about 80 to 90 physicians in southern Santa Barbara County have referred one or more patients to me because they are aware that cannabis is a medicine and that they were not taught about the endocannabinoid system. And of course, there's a reason for that, and that is that the endocannabinoid system was only characterized in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and even as late as 2014, only 13% of medical schools were teaching about the endocannabinoid system, let alone talking about the medicinal value of cannabis. So they can reach me. My name is spelled Bearman, like bears in the woods. B as in boy, Earman. You can check me out on the internet. I got lots of contact there. My phone number is 805-961-9988. My website is davidbeermanmd.com. If you want to know more about cannabis, you can also go to the website of the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine, of which I'm the executive vice president. The address of that is aacmsite.org. And again, that's the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine. We have a number of informational things that are on that, and we're expanding that as time goes on. I think over the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to see an enormous explosion of not only information that we already know, but we're going to be gaining new information as we destigmatize cannabis. Your audience might also be interested that in 2016, at a conference called the State of Marijuana, which is held in Long Beach, Dana Rohrabacher, who actually has been very favorable towards marijuana. However, I do hope he gets defeated in the next election because he's a big supporter of Donald Trump. And at the conference, what he said is that he thought that Mr. Trump would legalize marijuana. And the reason that he thought that is that Donald J. Trump had applied tincture of cannabis to bursitis in his shoulder, which I guess he got from playing golf or playing tennis, and that it was helpful. So we know that Donald J. Trump understands that cannabis has medicinal value. Whether or not he will legalize it, as Representative Rohrabacher theorized, I don't know. But Rohrabacher knows him better than I do.
Well, Dr. Beerman, I want to thank you for your time. I appreciate, because I know you're really busy.
I'm a little bit guilty of giving away my knowledge and information. I'm passionate about this. I'm enthusiastic about this. If people want to sit down and talk with me, they'll need to make an appointment. They will get charged for that. Most of the questions that I get now are questions that I've already answered, so it's not too difficult to answer them for people. One thing I think that your audience should be aware of is that cannabis is useful for treating attention deficit disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, autism, and Asperger's syndrome. And those are a lot of people who are into this are aware of that, but people who are just in the general public may not know that those are conditions that they should think about in terms of cannabis medical utility.
Well, thank you again for all the information, Doc. And folks, you guys out there, if you need to get a hold of Dr. Beerman, I will post his phone number on the show notes. And everybody else, hang tight, and I will be back in a little bit. Well, I'm back in studio by myself. By in studio, I mean my living room. I want to thank Dr. David Beerman for taking the time to talk to me about the endocannabinoid system. I plan on having other doctors on the show to continue the conversation about it. So keep an eye out for that. Well, mi gente, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. You can find us on Stitcher, or you can go to the website inmygrow.com, and you can subscribe to the website, and you'll get notifications about when new episodes go up. And remember, if this show has educated you or entertained you in any way, go over to patreon.com, find In My Grow Show, and donate a few dollars to us. Every amount is appreciated. And that money helps me pay for hosting fees, for equipment. If you don't want to donate, you can go over to the website and buy a Cannabis Saves Lives t-shirt. Now, if you can't help financially, don't sweat it. Don't worry about it. And here's how you can help the show, is that you can tell 3 other people about it. That's it. Real simple, real easy. Now, if you're a company that wants to advertise on the show, whether you've got a product or a service, once again, you can email me. That's inmygrow@gmail.com. Or you can find me on Instagram @inmygrow. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as always, don't forget to grow, learn, and teach.